We've all heard the saying, American is apple pie. The question is, what are the real origins of apple pie? That's what we're going to be looking at today. Thanks for joining us. So where does American apple pie come from? Well, if we look back in the cookbooks and we dig back to, say, the early 19th century or, say, 1850, that's when American cookbooks really start to, you get a lot of them. 1824, Virginia housewife, you'll find an apple pie recipe that you're probably used to. If we dig back a little bit further, we get back to the first American cookbook, Amelia Simmons's American Cookery. She's got an apple tart that's we might still call an apple pie, but the origins have to come a little bit deeper than that. If we dig back a little bit deeper, another 20 or 30 years, we find some English cookery cookbooks which have apple pies. Kinds that maybe we are a little bit more used to. Today we'll be looking at a particular apple pie recipe, very similar to others, out of the Universal Cookbook. This one's done by John Townsend in 1773. Let's get started. You're looking for pie apples to start off with. We've got some Golden Delicious here. That's going to work. The Jonathan apples make a nice pie apple. In the time period, you'll see a lot of references to codling apples. Again, those are a cooking apple or a baking apple. That's what we want for our apple pie, and that's what the recipe calls for. We need to pare our apples, so we would need to take the peels off with these. And we're going to save these peels. We're going to use them in just a little bit. Once we've got our apples peeled, we can quarter them and cut the cores out and then set our apples aside. And now with the peels, we want to take a little saucepan, and you can take all your peels, maybe even some of your cores, but I wouldn't do that. But take these peels a little bit with a little bit of water, and what we want to do is set this over the fire and kind of boil this down. You could even use apple cider as instead of the water. What we're doing is making a concentrated apple saucy flavor that we're going to add to the pie in a little bit. So let's just put this on a low simmer while we work on the rest of this. Now that our apples are pared and cut up, let's work on our pie plate so we can start to assemble this pie. Now this recipe is not like a standard apple pie that we would do. We would put a crust in this entire pie plate. But like so many of these English pie recipes, this one calls for puff paste, and the puff paste just goes around the lip or the outside edge of this. So obviously we're not going to have a slice of pie like we expect today. That's not how they would have necessarily served it. So I've got a little bit of puff paste here, and we're just going to put it around the outside of our dish. There's our paste, at least our lower paste. We actually are going to cover this pie up later on. Now we get to put our apple slices in, or at least the first part of our apple slices. So we put in a layer of apples. And obviously, depending on how big your pie plate is, you may only need a single layer. I don't know if I'm going to be able to get a whole lot more than a single layer in this one, but we're going to get a layer of apples in the bottom. After we get our first layer in, we can add a little bit of sugar here. I would put in maybe, it depends on the sweetness of your apples, but, and of course the recipe says sweeten to taste. So I'll go with about 1/4 cup, maybe a little bit less, and then we can put a little bit more apples in here. Actually, before we put in the next layer, let's put in our spice or our added flavor, and they call for lemon zest, and so actually chopped up lemon peel. So I got what we would call lemon zest, the very outer layer of lemon. We're going to put that in here, a nice goodly amount, and I'm going to add a little bit of lemon juice while I'm at it, and this will give it a nice tart flavor. Before we put in our last layer, we can put in a little bit of spice here. There are not many spices called for in this other than the lemon here, but possibly a little bit of nutmeg, or usually even cinnamon isn't talked about until we get to the 19th century. So we're going to go with a little bit of nutmeg. Don't need very much in this. The apples are really going to carry most of that along with the lemon juice. Let's go ahead and put in the last little bit of apple Some recipes, especially early on, they really turn these apples into more like apple sauce. But we want them to still have some body, like an apple pie that we're used to today. And this recipe does call basically just for quartering them, not even small slices. So we want them to still be apple-like when we take them out. For some extra spice, add a blade of mace to the peels and the cider. So our peels and the cider and a little bit of mace is boiled down, and we're just going to pour a little bit of this over the top. This will give an extra sauce down in the bottom. Now the final part is to add a little bit more sugar up on top. Again, about the same amount as you put in the lower section, maybe a quarter cup. Again, depends on the sweetness of your apples. And this is ready to have the top crust put on. You'll want your crust to seal up, so you might want to add a little bit of water to the very edge. And this is all sealed up and it's ready to go in the oven, in a modern oven in your kitchen. You'll probably want to set it to 375 degrees and it'll probably cook for, let's say 35 to 45 minutes. You'll be able to tell by the top crust. If you want it to get a real nice brown color, you'll probably want to brush a little bit of egg on top to get a nice color to it. Let's get this one going. There's our pie. It looks wonderful. It's cooled off enough that we can handle it. Now, normally we might serve it just like this, but all these recipes sort of agree that we're going to do a little bit more to this pie. The first step is to cut the top of it off. I'm just gonna slice around the top of this, and we want to take the top off. Now we're not gonna discard this top, obviously. There we are. Oh, smells wonderful. Smells very nice. So here's our old pie there. Next up, what we need to do is pour in a special custard. Now, John Townsend's recipe in the Universal Cook, he does not do a very good job of explaining what's going on with this custard. And you know what? We'll do a different episode specifically on this custard, but now we're gonna take this custard and pour it in to the top of our pie. There we are. And you want it to sort of cover up the entire top of it. There's our custard. Now we're going to set this aside for just a second and let's deal with this top that we had. Now it calls for cutting the top up in triangles, little triangles. I don't know how big, it doesn't say, explain that. So we're just going to cut this up in slices and then turn those into triangles. Now we take our little triangles and we put them in here. Now it says there are a couple different directions maybe, but they're all very similar. We can either lay them around the outside edge, and we'll do a couple like that, I guess it said with the points out, just to make it look festive, because this is sort of a complicated recipe, so it probably is meant for festive occasions. And then we can put some that are vertical if we can get that to work. I guess it all depends on how thick our custard is. So we're ready to serve this up. Now obviously, since we can't slice this out in regular pie pieces, it's just gonna have to get put into a little, into individual servings. Just kind of scoop it out here. And I'll make sure to get one of those triangles of puff paste, because that's gonna be good. And there we are. We'll set this that one aside. Whew. Smells really, really good, and I can see where this custard would come in. You mean we like to eat our apple pie with ice cream? They had ice cream in the time period, but it'd be a lot easier to make a custard like this. So let's find out how it turns out. Wow, whoa, what a wonderful combination. Puff paste, custard, apple pie, all built into one. Really, really tremendously good. I love this, going back just a little bit deeper and finding this English recipe for apple pie right out of the late 18th century. What a wonderful recipe, just in time for the holidays. I hope you get a chance to make this one, and if you're interested in another apple recipe out of the 18th century, try this video here.